My name is Captain Miller. I've spent 30 years on the Atlantic, mostly hauling freight between Europe and the East Coast. Over that chimney, you get used to the solitude, the constant rhythm of the waves, the deep hum of the engines. It becomes part of you. But you also learn that the ocean is a graveyard and it never, ever sleeps. In the fall of 2022, we were crossing the Sargasso Sea, a region notorious for its calm, almost unnervingly eerie waters and thick, sprawling mats of seaweed. We were already 3 days behind schedule due to a turbine issue, which forced us to take a shortcut. We pushed through a sector that most modern charts simply mark as unreliable. It was around 3 in the morning when the radar started chirping. A massive blip dead ahead, but there was no ice signal, no lights, and absolutely no radio response. Just a mountain of steel, drifting silently in the profound darkness. As we got closer, we could make out its form. The vessel was an old Soviet-era research ship, the Vidyu Muzikal Vokovi. It looked like it had been floating for decades, completely covered in a thick coat of rust and salt. It was a ghost ship, a relic from a forgotten time. Against my better judgment, but bound by maritime law to check for survivors, I decided to send a small boarding party. It would be myself and 2 of my best engineers, Sarah and Leo. The moment our boots hit the deck of the Volkov, the air changed. It became unnaturally cold, a sharp, biting chill that had nothing to do with the night and the smell. It was overwhelming. It smelled like stagnant water mixed with something else, something old and metallic like copper. The entire ship was leaning slightly to the port side, groaning softly with the gentle sway of the ocean. We made our way to the bridge. What we found there was deeply unsettling. Everything was left as if the crew had just vanished mid-action. There were half-eaten meals on the table, coffee mugs, still full but bone-dry, their contents long since evaporated into dust. We found the ship's logs. They ended abruptly on June 14, 1984. The last entry was just one chilling sentence. "It's not the water that's coming inside." While Leo started working to see if the ship had any emergency power left, Sarah and I headed down to the lower decks, flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. And that's when we heard it. A rhythmic, metallic tapping coming from somewhere inside the ventilation ducts. Clang, clang, clang. It wasn't a random noise. It felt deliberate. It was following us. We reached the engine room, a vast, cavernous space filled with silent machinery. The beam of my flashlight caught something in the corner. A pile of clothes, crew uniforms, neatly folded and stacked. Strange, but not impossible. I reached out and touched one of the shirts. The fabric instantly crumbled into a fine, gray ash in my hand. And then the tapping stopped. From the deep darkness of the propeller shaft tunnel, we heard a voice. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was the sound of my own voice, coming from the shadows, whispering my name. "Miller?" it said. "Stay behind. The tide is turning." I hadn't spoken a single word since we boarded. My radio was off, but the voice was identical to mine. Panic started to set in. We turned to leave, running back the way we came, but the door we had entered through was gone. Not locked, not jammed. It was just gone. In its place was a solid wall of rusted steel that looked like it had been there for 100 years. Just then, the entire ship began to groan. A deep, resonating sound so loud it felt like the very metal of the vessel was screaming in agony. Sarah suddenly pointed her light down at the floor. The shadows cast by the machinery weren't moving with our lights. They were fixed in place, like permanent black stains on the deck. As we watched, one of the shadows shaped like a tall, horribly distorted man, began to peel itself off the floor. It didn't have a face, just a vertical slit that hummed with a low-frequency vibration we could feel in our bones. At that exact moment, Leo's voice crackled over the intercom from the bridge, sounding distorted and impossibly far away. "Captain!" he yelled. "Don't look at the water. It's not water anymore." We rushed to a nearby porthole and looked out. The ocean surrounding the Volkov had transformed. It was no longer water. It had turned into a thick, black sludge that churned slowly, unnaturally. It wasn't a liquid. It was moving, crawling up the sides of the hull, like thousands of tiny, dark fingers. The ship wasn't just drifting. It was being pulled down, dragged into something that wasn't the sea floor. We found a maintenance hatch that we hoped would lead to the upper deck. As we scrambled out into the cold night air, I saw them, the crew of the Volkov. They were standing on the bow, hundreds of them, perfectly still, all staring down into the black sludge below. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They looked like statues carved from salt and rust, their faces frozen in a silent, eternal watch. There was no other choice. We leaped off the side of the ship, back toward our transport boat, plunging into the blackness. The water riff, you can even call it that, felt like freezing oil. It was thick, heavy, and it tried to pull us under, wrapping around our limbs like heavy chain. We fought, kicking and clawing our way back to our own ship, every inch a struggle for survival. As soon as we were back aboard our vessel, we hit the searchlights, aiming them back where the ghost ship had been. The MV Volkov was gone. There were no ripples, no debris, not even a trace, just the empty, calm Sargasso Sea, as if it had never been there at all. Later, the authorities told us there was no record of a ship called the Volkov ever existing. They said it was a hallucination, a trick of the light and exhaustion. But I have the proof. I kept the logbook I found on the bridge, and every time I open it, the ink seems to have changed. Now, the last entry isn't from 1984 anymore. It's in my own handwriting, dated for tomorrow, and it says, "I can still hear the tapping in my own walls. My name is Marcus." In 2023, I took a job as a night security guard for a massive decommissioned medical research center called St. Jude's. It was a sprawling complex of 5 buildings, all connected by underground tunnels. The job itself sounded easy. Stay in the security booth, watch the monitors, and do one physical patrol of the entire perimeter at exactly 3 a.m. The pay was incredible, mostly because nobody else wanted the job. The previous guard had just vanished, quitting without any notice. He just left his keys and his flashlight right there on the desk. On my first night, the supervisor gave me a very specific, very strange instruction. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you see a light on in Building C, 3rd floor, do not go in to turn it off. Just report it in the log and wait for sunrise." I thought it was just some weird company policy, maybe a power grid issue. I had no idea it was a warning. For the first 2 weeks, it was the easiest job I'd ever had. Seriously, I just sat in the booth, drank way too much coffee, and listened to podcasts to pass the time. The silence of the place was immense, but it didn't bother me. It was peaceful. But on the 15th night, that peace was shattered. Around 2:15 a.m., I saw it, a flicker on monitor 9. It was focused on Building C, the 3rd floor. A single light had switched on. It wasn't the cold, sharp flicker of a modern LED. It was a warm, pulsing glow, the kind you get from an old incandescent bulb. It felt alive. I immediately remembered the supervisor's warning, my heart starting to pound in my chest. But just as I was about to write it in the log, I noticed something else on the screen. There was a person. Someone was standing in the hallway, directly under that strange, pulsing light. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the camera. Their face was a complete blur of static, like the signal couldn't quite resolve the image. I leaned in, trying to make sense of it. I zoomed the camera in, and that's when my blood ran absolutely cold. The person was wearing a security uniform, a uniform identical to mine. He was holding a flashlight, and he started to signal with it, flashing it toward the camera in Morse code. It took me a second to decipher it, my hands trembling. Eli punto pata P, help. Against my better judgment, every rational thought screamed at me to stay put, but my mind raced with possibilities. Was it the previous guard? Was he trapped in there? Maybe it was just some elaborate, cruel prank. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I grabbed my gear, my heart thumping against my ribs, and headed into the underground tunnels. The air down there was stagnant and heavy, thick with the smell of ozone, and something else, something like old bandages. Every single step I took echoed around me, multiplying until it sounded like a small army was marching with me. When I finally reached the entrance to Building C, the elevator shouldn't have been working. The whole building was decommissioned, but the doors were standing wide open, almost like they were waiting for me. My hand shook as I hit the button for the 3rd floor. As the elevator creaked upwards, a voice, a dry whisper, slithered through the overhead vent. "You're late for your shift, Marcus." The words froze me in place. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped out into a hallway that was completely wrong. It looked brand new. There was no dust, no peeling paint, none of the decay that plagued the rest of the facility. It was pristine. At the far end of the hall, I could see it the warm, pulsing light from the monitor. But as I started walking toward it, the hallway seemed to stretch, to elongate. The faster I ran, the further away the light became. I stopped, breathless and confused, and looked back. The elevator was gone. In its place was a solid wall of mirrors. But in the reflection, I wasn't alone. A dozen versions of me were standing in the hallway, all of them looking in different directions, their faces masks of pure terror. I realized then that this wasn't about a faulty light. Building C wasn't some abandoned research center. It was a trap, a labyrinth designed to study something far darker than any medicine. Panic took over. I frantically searched for an exit and found a door marked maintenance. I threw my shoulder against it, hoping for a staircase, a fire escape, anything. The door burst open, and I stumbled through, not into a stairwell, but back into the security booth. I was back where I started. I gasped for air, my head spinning, and looked at the bank of monitors. My eyes shot to monitor 9, and I saw myself. I was standing in the hallway of the 3rd floor, looking directly at the camera, my hand clutching my flashlight. I watched, horrified, as my own reflection on the screen began to signal in Morse code HELP. I scrambled to get out of the booth, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. Then the phone on the desk rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence. I picked it up. It was the supervisor. His voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. "I told you not to go to the 3rd floor, Marquez," he gurgled. "Now you have to finish the shift. All of them." I slammed the phone down and looked at the digital clock on the desk. It read 3 a.m. I waited, my eyes glued to the numbers. An hour must have passed, my mind racing, but When I looked again, the clock still said 3 a.m. Outside the booth windows, the sun never rose. It's been 3 a.m. for what feels like years now. The shift never ends. I'm writing this on the back of an old security log. If you're reading this, it probably means you've just started your first night at St. Jude's. You're sitting in this very booth, looking at the incredible salary, wondering what the catch is. Let me tell you, look at monitor 9. Sooner or later, you'll see me. You'll see my light, signaling to you from the 3rd floor of Building C. When you do, please, for the love of God, do not come for me. Ignore the message. Write it in the log and wait for the sun. Just stay in the booth, because if you come up here to try and help me, you'll just take my place. There will be 2 of us on the screen, another guard trapped in the hall, and the door to that booth will never, ever open for you again. The 3rd floor doesn't want employees. It just wants replacements. Thank you for listening. My name is Sarah. I've always been someone who is careful about my digital footprint. I use a VPN complex passwords, and I never post my real-time location. But in October of 2024, I discovered that privacy is an illusion we sell to ourselves just so we can sleep at night. It all started with a brown paper package on my porch. There was no return address, just my name and home address, written in a technical, almost mechanical handwriting. Inside, there was a collection of nonsensical items: a bamboo toothbrush, a 1994 edition of a cooking magazine, and a small vial of perfume that smelled exactly like the soap my grandmother used before she passed away. I thought it was a shipping error from some shopping algorithm until I received the email. The subject line was just a number, #001. The body of the text read, "Thank you for subscribing to the live stream. Your first delivery was personalized based on your deepest memories. Enjoy the nostalgia." I ignored the email, thinking it was some form of aggressive marketing or a scam. But the packages kept coming, one every 3 days, and each one was more specific than the last. In the 3rd package, I received a silver key that opened a diary I had lost when I was 12 years old. In the 5th, I received a Polaroid photo taken of my living room window, taken exactly 5 minutes before I opened the door to pick up the package. What terrified me wasn't just the content, but the logistics. I live in a building with 24-hour security and cameras in every hallway. I went to the monitoring room and asked to see the footage of the deliveries. The security guard, a man who has worked here for years, turned pale as we watched the screen. In the footage, the package simply appeared on my porch. There was no delivery man, no drones, no shadows. In one frame, the porch was empty. In the very next frame, the package was just there. It was as if reality itself had suffered a glitch. I tried to cancel the subscription. I replied to the email demanding they stop. The response came back instantly. To cancel, you must return the most valuable item we sent you. However, you haven't received it yet. That night, I decided not to sleep. I barricaded the door and sat on the sofa with a baseball bat. At 3:33 a.m., I heard the sound of something being dragged down the hallway. It wasn't a human footstep. It sounded like metal scraping against concrete. I looked through the peephole, but it was covered by something dark. Suddenly, the TV in the living room turned on by itself. It wasn't static. It was a live broadcast from my own phone's camera, which was in my hand. The image showed me sitting on a sofa, but the perspective was from inside my own fireplace, a place where there is no room for a camera, let alone a person. The broadcast on the TV changed. Now it showed a dark room filled with servers and screens. In the center of the room was an industrial 3D printer, but it wasn't printing plastic. It was printing something organic, something that looked like skin. The final email arrived on my phone. Your final item has been delivered. Please open the door for the cancellation. I heard my electronic door lock beep. Click. The door opened slowly. In the hallway, there was no monster or murderer. There was a person standing there. She was wearing the same clothes as me. She had the same hair, the same scar on her arm, and the same look of terror. She was an exact copy of me, but her eyes were completely black as if they had been printed without irises. She didn't attack me. She just reached out her hand and whispered in my own voice, "Thank you for taking care of my life while I was being processed. You can go now." I ran. I ran down the stairs, out of the building, and I never went back. I've been living in motels, paying for everything in cash, and staying off the grid. But the paranoia never leaves me. Yesterday, while I was at a roadside diner, I saw a woman identical to me sitting in a luxury car in the parking lot. She was living my life, talking to my friends, probably sleeping in my bed. The worst part is that this morning I found a brown paper package at the door of my motel room. Inside was my own original ID card, which I thought was in my bag, and a note that said, "Subscription canceled successfully. The original has been discarded." If you ever receive a package that knows you better than you know yourself, don't open it. The moment you recognize what's inside, you give them permission to replace you. My name is Elias. For 10 years, I was a structural surveyor for the City of London. My job was to inspect the forgotten layers, the Victorian sewers, the abandoned tube stations, the bunkers left over from the Cold War. But in the summer of 2024, I was assigned to a project that didn't exist on any public map. Sector 9. Officially, it was a cavernous foundation, 300 feet below a new luxury skyscraper development. The blueprints showed a simple concrete grid, a standard, boring job. But when I descended in the service elevator, I found something entirely different. The elevator didn't stop at the basement. It just kept going for 6 minutes in total, deafening silence. When the doors finally hissed open, I wasn't in a construction site. I was standing at the edge of a subterranean city, built from a black, non-reflective stone that seemed to swallow the light from my headlamp. There were no lights, no sounds of the city above, just an ocean of cold, stagnant air that felt like it was pressing against my lungs, heavy and ancient. My task was a perimeter sweep. I began walking, my industrial flashlight cutting a sharp blade through the oppressive dark. The architecture of Sector 9 defied all logic, all human design. The corridors were impossibly tall, stretching up into a darkness my beam couldn't penetrate. The doorways were too narrow, too sharp, clearly not made for a person to pass through comfortably. I found rooms, vast halls filled with thousands upon thousands of rusted filing cabinets. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled one open. Inside, there were no documents, no files, just rows of small glass jars filled with gray ash, each one meticulously labeled with a name and a date. My blood ran cold when I saw them. Some of the dates, they were from the future. The silence in that place was an entity in itself. It started to play tricks on me. I began to hear a rhythmic thrumming, a vibration so low I felt it in my teeth, in my bones. I followed the sound, my boots echoing unnaturally, to a central plaza. There, a massive pillar of obsidian rose into the darkness, its peak lost to the void. At the base of the pillar, I found a pile of modern equipment, iPhones, laptops, hard hats, just like me. They were all melted, fused together into a single, grotesque mound of plastic and glass. My flashlight flickered just for a second. In that brief, stuttering flash of light, I saw them. A row of figures standing on a balcony high above me. They weren't moving. They were just watching me, their eyes reflecting my light like the eyes of a cat in the dead of night. I turned to run to get back to the elevator. But the path was gone. The black stone walls had shifted while I wasn't looking. The corridor I'd walked down was no longer there. I was lost in a labyrinth that felt alive, that was actively changing around me. That's when I heard it. My own voice, calling out for help from a side tunnel. It sounded exactly like me. The same pitch, the same terrified, ragged breath. Is anyone there? I'm near the pillar. I followed the voice, a desperate hope surging in my chest that I'd found another survivor. I rounded a corner and stopped dead. The voice was narrating my own thoughts, my current actions. He's stopped, it whispered. He's starting to realize. The voice came from a shadow that was detached from any object, a patch of pure darkness clinging to the wall. I shone my light on it, and the shadow stretched. It deepened, becoming a three-dimensional shape. It began to mimic my movements, perfectly synchronized. I raised my hand. It raised a clawed, obsidian limb. I stepped back. It stepped forward. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a blueprint of me, being filled in by the very darkness of the sector. Panic gave me strength. I found a ventilation shaft. It's great. Already dislodged. I started climbing, scrambling for what felt like hours, maybe days. My hands were bleeding, shredded by the sharp obsidian edges of the shaft. The air grew hotter, smelling of ozone and burning hair, a sickeningly sweet scent. I could hear them below me, the residents of Sector 9. They didn't scream or shout. They wheezed a sound that harmonized into a terrifying, dissonant chord that vibrated through the metal around me. Finally, my fingers brushed against a service hatch. I burst through it, screaming for help, tumbling onto a concrete floor. The construction workers looked at me with utter confusion, a few of them laughing. To them, I had only been gone for 10 minutes. But when I stumbled to a washroom and looked in the mirror, my hair had streaks of gray, and my watch, a reliable, mechanical one, had recorded 3 weeks of time. I resigned the next day. I didn't give a reason. The skyscraper was completed 6 months later. People live there now in multi-million-dollar penthouses, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire lives are built on top of a city that is waiting patiently to be filled. Sometimes I stand outside that building at night. If you press your ear against the cold glass of the lobby window, you won't hear the city traffic. You'll hear a faint, rhythmic thrumming coming from deep, deep below. And if you listen long enough, you might just hear your own voice whispering back to you from the dark.